The night sky hung heavy over the forgotten town of Blackwood. Clouds pressed low, smothering the moon, and the forest surrounding. The settlement breathed with a rhythm that did not belong to the living. Daniel Reeves drove his old pickup slowly down the dirt road, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires the only sound cutting through the silence. He had inherited the house at the edge of town, an ancient, rotting Victorian mansion that had once belonged to his grandfather. Locals warned him not to stay there. They whispered about disappearances, strange screams at night, and shadows moving in the windows when no one lived inside. Daniel, however, dismissed them as superstitions born of boredom. The town was dying, its streets littered with abandoned shops, its air reeking of damp wood and rust. He told himself it was just a storybook horror, something to be laughed at when the lights were on. When he finally reached the mansion, the headlights illuminated its cracked facade. Shingles dangled from the roof like broken teeth, and the porch sagged under the weight of decades. The windows seemed to glisten, not from glass, but from something wet clinging to the frames. A shiver ran down Daniel's spine, but he forced himself to breathe and muttered, "It's just a house." Inside, the air was colder than outside, sharp and metallic like blood. Each step made the floor moan beneath his boots. Dust rose in pale clouds, and cobwebs trembled in the corners. He flicked on a flashlight, its weak beam stretching, across faded wallpaper patterned, with roses that had turned brown over time. His phone showed no signal. The power lines were dead, the wires outside torn as though bitten. As Daniel explored, he noticed that the mirrors scattered throughout the mansion were wrong. They reflected angles that didn't exist, doorways that were closed, and faint figures moving behind him that vanished when he turned. In one long hallway, he froze. His reflection did not move with him. Instead, it stayed still, eyes fixed, smiling. His chest tightened. He shut his eyes and shook his head. When he looked again, the reflection was gone. Only his pale, shaken face stared back. That night, as he tried to sleep in the master bedroom, the house breathed. He heard timbers expanding and contracting like lungs, staircases creaking as the weight pressed upon them. The faint sound of whispers drifted from the floorboards, too low to understand, but clear enough to prove he was not alone. At precisely 3 o'clock, his eyes snapped open. He had not meant to wake, but something had stirred him. The air was dense, pressing down on his chest. A shadow passed over his blanket. Slowly, trembling, he turned his head toward the mirror in the corner of the room. His body remained in bed, but in the reflection, he was standing at the foot of the bed, staring directly at himself. Daniel sat upright in bed, frozen, unable to look away from the mirror. His reflection stood at the foot of the bed, grinning with a mouth too wide, teeth too sharp, eyes hollow. He felt his skin crawl, a primal terror digging its claws into his chest. Slowly, the reflection raised its hand, curling one finger in a beckoning gesture. The sound of scratching filled the room. From beneath the bed, something clawed at the wood, impatient and hungry. Daniel forced himself to move, fumbling for his flashlight, the beam trembling as it swept across the room. The mirror now showed nothing, only his pale, trembling face. But the scratching didn't stop. He backed toward the door, heart hammering so hard he could barely breathe. The doorknob was freezing cold when he grabbed it, as though it had been left outside in the snow. Behind him, the bed sheets shifted, as if someone unseen had just rolled over. He yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway, the air heavier, thicker, almost liquid in its resistance. The mansion seemed to pulse. Walls groaned and swayed. Doors along the corridor shivered, as though fists pounded from the other side. Shadows darted across the ceiling, too quick to catch. At the end of the hallway, a faint red glow flickered beneath the door. Against every instinct, Daniel was drawn to it. When he opened it, He found himself in what looked like a study. Shelves lined the walls, paintings hung from the ceiling. The mirror, now showed nothing, only his pale, trembling face. Daniel forced himself to move, fumbling for his flashlight, the beam trembling as it swept across the room. The reflection, did not move with him. Instead, it stayed still, eyes fixed, smiling. His chest tightened. He shut his eyes and shook his head. When he looked again, the reflection was gone. Only his pale, shaken face stared back. That night, as he tried to sleep in the master bedroom, the house breathed. The filled with old books bound in leather, their spines cracked and titles in languages he could not read. On the desk lay an open journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. He skimmed the entries and felt his stomach twist. The words spoke of rituals, of mirrors used as gateways, of reflections that could detach and walk free. His grandfather's name appeared again and again, linked to experiments in summoning. The last entry ended with a warning. Once the reflection smiles on its own, it is too late. The mirror above the desk suddenly rippled, its surface bending like water. A pale hand pressed out from the glass, fingertips clawing the wood frame. Then came another hand, followed by a face identical to his own but twisted. Its skin hung to loose, its grin stretched ear to ear, eyes glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. Daniel stumbled back, but the doppelganger pulled itself free, landing on the floor with a wet, slapping sound. As though its flesh were not solid, it tilted its head, smiled wider, and whispered in his own voice, "You should never have come home." The study door slammed shut behind him. Daniel staggered backward, his breath ragged as the thing that wore his face advanced. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if pulled by strings. Every step it took left damp footprints on the wooden floor. Though its body looked dry, it cocked its head, mimicking his trembling stance, but with mockery etched into its grin. Desperate, Daniel snatched the journal from the desk and hurled it at the creature. The book struck its chest with a dull thud, and for a moment, the doppelganger flickered, like an image on a broken screen. The mirror behind it pulsed, as if alive, rippling with waves that distorted the room's reflection. The thing hissed, a sound that seemed to claw directly at his ears, and lunged. Daniel bolted toward the door, wrenching it open just as the monster's fingers scraped his arm, leaving burning welts. He stumbled into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind him. The mansion's walls shivered, dust raining from the ceiling. Somewhere upstairs, a door banged open and shut repeatedly, though no wind stirred. Daniel ran down the staircase, his flashlight beam cutting through the suffocating dark. The portraits along the walls seemed to follow him with their eyes. One frame had shattered, but instead of canvas inside, it was filled with a dull, foggy glass. His reflection in it twitched a fraction too late when he moved past. He reached the front door and clawed at the locks. The chain rattled, but no matter how he twisted the knob, the door would not open. It was as though the wood itself had fused shut. Behind him, the sound of wet footsteps descended the stairs. Daniel spun and darted toward the kitchen. Cabinets hung open, their contents scattered across the floor. Knives rusted with each lay among rotted food. He snatched one, gripping it tight, though his hand shook violently. The sound of his double grew closer, each step deliberate, savoring the chase. Suddenly, the kitchen window rattled. Daniel rushed to it, slamming his fists against the glass. Outside, the forest loomed, branches writhing like skeletal fingers. He screamed for help, but the trees seemed to lean closer, muffling his voice. His own reflection in the window appeared first before his, double-stepped into view behind him. The creature reached for him with elongated fingers, nails like shards of obsidian. Daniel spun and slashed with the knife. The blade tore through its chest, releasing not blood but a thick, black mist that reeked of iron and decay. The doppelganger staggered back, then began to laugh in his voice layered with dozens of others. The knife clattered from his hand. Daniel's vision blurred as the mist filled the room, seeping into his lungs. His double stepped closer, pressing its forehead against his. Its whisper was soft, intimate, and final. "You are mine now." Daniel collapsed onto the floor, coughing violently as the black mist filled his lungs. His vision swam, walls bending and stretching like molten wax. The doppelganger loomed over him, but as its hand reached for his chest, the mansion itself seemed to resist. The floorboards trembled, Doors along the hallway slammed open and shut, and the lights of candles he hadn't lit flickered to life in the corners. The mist retreated slightly, drawn into the air vents and cracks of the house. The creature snarled, its glowing eyes dimming for the first time. Daniel crawled backward, gasping for air. He realized then that the mansion wasn't just cursed, it was alive, and it wasn't entirely on the creature's side. From the corner of the kitchen, a low moan rose. Daniel turned to see a hidden door sliding open, revealing a stairwell descending into the earth. He hesitated. Knowing instinct told him not to go deeper, but the doppelganger hissed, claws scraping against the ceiling, forcing his choice. With no other escape, Daniel stumbled down the stone steps into the dark. The passage spiraled, lit by faint, phosphorescent mold clinging to the walls. Whispers echoed, dozens of voices overlapping. Some cried in pain, others laughed hysterically, and a few whispered his name over and over again. Daniel pressed his hands against his ears, but the voices seeped directly into his skull. At the bottom, he found a vast underground chamber. Mirrors lined the walls, dozens of them, each showing twisted versions of himself. Some were burned, others mutilated, some with black eyes hollowed out completely. They all pressed their palms against the glass as though begging to be freed. In the center of the chamber stood a large, cracked mirror framed in bone. Its surface bled black liquid, dripping down onto the stone floor where symbols glowed faintly. The air around it pulsed with energy, bending sound and light. This was the source. His grandfather had built this chamber, perhaps believing he could control what lay beyond. Daniel approached cautiously, but the mirror rippled, and his doppelganger stepped through, more solid now, its body reinforced by the mist. Its grin had vanished, replaced with something worse than hunger. "Your flesh is a doorway," it rasped. "Once you are hollow, we will walk freely." Daniel gritted his teeth and grabbed a shard of broken mirror from the floor. "Its edge jagged. Then you'll have to kill me first." The chamber shook violently as the creature lunged. The chamber quaked as Daniel swung the jagged shard of mirror, the sound of glass cutting through the air like a scream. His doppelganger lunged, but the shard caught its arm, slicing through flesh that dissolved into tar like mist. The creature roared, its voice fractured into a chorus of echoes, shaking the mirrors lining the walls. One by one, the reflections within the smaller mirrors began to pound against the glass, their fists cracking the surface, faces twisted in agony and hunger, each reflection desperate to break free. Daniel realized the bone-framed mirror wasn't just a gateway, it was a prison. And now the walls were crumbling. The creature's hand wrapped around Daniel's throat, lifting him from the ground. Its strength was impossible, its grip freezing, veins bulging with black ichor. Spots danced before Daniel's eyes as he struggled. Desperation drove him to raise the shard and slam it into the monster's shoulder. It shrieked, releasing him, stumbling backward into the glowing runes. The chamber ignited with light. The runes burned red, the mirrors rattled, and the voices grew deafening. From every reflection, distorted versions of himself screamed, their mouths opening wider and wider until their jaws split. The glass began to shatter, spilling shadowy forms onto the stone floor. Daniel backed against the wall, his shard trembling in his hand. Dozens of twisted doppelgangers crawled free, their movements insect-like, their eyes glowing faintly. They dragged themselves across the floor toward him. The central creature grinned, its body reforming, mist coiling around its wounds. "You cannot fight us all," it said. "You are already one of us." Daniel glanced at the cracked bone-framed mirror. Its surface writhed like liquid, the black ooze thickening. He had a choice: be consumed here, or gamble with the unknown beyond. His chest tightened. His reflection in the nearest shard of glass smiled differently, almost encouraging. Before the swarm reached him, Daniel made his decision. With a desperate cry, he plunged the shard into the runes at the mirror's base. The chamber exploded in light and shadow. The blast of light hurled Daniel across the chamber, his back slamming against the cold stone wall. The swarm of creatures shrieked, their forms unraveling into black mist that were sucked violently toward the bone-framed mirror. The runes blazed like fire, cracks spreading across the mirror's surface. The doppelganger leader staggered, its body trembling as though it were being torn apart. "You fool," it screeched, "you will unkind us all." Daniel forced himself to his feet, his lungs burning, vision swimming. The black liquid poured faster from the mirror, forming rivers across the floor, winding toward his boots. His reflection in every shard stared at him, some screaming, some smiling, others whispering silently. But one reflection, a version of himself unbroken. Determined nodded. Gritting his teeth, Daniel raised the shard again and drove it deep into the largest crack. The mirror wailed, the sound like 1,000 voices howling at once. It shattered in an explosion of glass and black fire. The doppelganger leader let out a final, fractured scream as it was torn apart, sucked screaming into the void behind the mirror. One by one, the twisted figures vanished, dragged back into the abyss. The chamber shook so violently that stones fell from the ceiling, crushing what remained of the runes. And then silence. Daniel stood alone, the bone frame nothing but rubble at his feet. The mist thinned, evaporating into the air. He dropped the shard, his hand bloody, his chest heaving. Slowly, he climbed back up the stone stairwell, the weight of the house pressing around him. When he reached the surface, dawn was breaking. The mansion loomed behind him, its windows shattered, its walls groaning like a dying beast. He stepped outside, the forest eerily still. For the first time since arriving, he felt the air fill his lungs freely. But as he walked away, something caught his eye in the window. His reflection, smiling.